just to get us going and to remind ourselves and to inform those who haven't been here, I'd ask each of our lecturers just to give us a recap of their position and what they said, and also maybe something about their particular area of expertise and interest, so you just know a little bit more, and then we can take off from there. So, I hope that's okay. Just get us going. So maybe if we start down at your end, Matt.
Certainly.
If that's all right, please.
Morning, everybody. I'm Professor Matthew Woodcock. I'm Professor of Medieval and Early Modern Literature at the Department of the School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing at the UEA, down the road in Norwich. A big part of my research at the moment, and over the last 2 years, has been looking at the records of early English drama for Tudor and Stuart Norwich. And so that's involved looking at lots of the, less so in terms of kind of play texts, but looking at lots of the regulatory information, rewards of payments to players, and looking at lots of the other kind of wider festive culture linked with, in the first instance, early modern Norwich, but then more broadly early modern East Anglia as well. So not just drama, but music, festivity, sports, rather grisly things like bear baitings, wrestling. There was a healthy wrestling scene in mid-Tudor Norwich. Who knew? And the longer vision of this editorial project is revising a volume of these records, which will eventually be put online and open access. And it forms part of a much bigger research project based in Canada at the University of Toronto, which is putting together all of, or as many as we can find, of the records of early English drama. This is a long research project that's been running since the 70s. I've not been involved with it since the 70s, and will continue running for probably another couple of generations as we begin to put forward really a history of what English and Welsh and Scots drama looked like, not just Shakespeare, not just London, but more broadly and more provincially. That's led me into doing some research on provincial guild halls, and that was the basis of the first half of the paper I gave yesterday. I was talking about the importance of guild halls, buildings such as this, and such as Trinity Guildhall, it's down the road, and thinking about how they would have functioned both as places where actors and companies, as they visited Lynn and other towns, would have sought license to perform, and also they would have been places where performances would have taken place, perhaps on a stage very much like this, or others. I then focused on one particular visit of one particular company, looking at the Earl of Pembroke's Men, a company with which Shakespeare had been connected in the early 1590s, in the so-called lost years. I looked at the period of 1592-3 and put forward a case for the fact that trying to place Shakespeare in the Earl of Pembroke's Men, and then placing the Earl of Pembroke's Men here, and then placing the Earl of Pembroke's Men here at St George's Guildhall as well. And so we've kind of got from the bigger picture of my research to the exciting bit, the controversial bit, and the bit which will, I'm sure, be several threads and seams that we can pick up and take and explore later today. So that's...
Thank you, Matt. Yes. Thank you. Pete?
Morning, everyone. I'm Pete Smith. I'm a reader in Renaissance Lit at Nottingham Trent University. On the first evening of the festival, Andrew mentioned a book, quite an influential book now, of the 1960s, Jan Kott's Shakespeare, Our Contemporary. And unlike the other experts on this panel, my interest in the contemporary is the other contemporary. That's to say, not the early moderns as much as reception, Shakespeare's reception today. So I'm quite interested in contemporary. I do quite a lot of work on film adaptation. I do a great deal of work on theatre reviewing, the reception of Shakespeare in the modern theatre, and I wrote my first book was about Shakespeare under Thatcherism, Shakespeare in the 1980s. That's really where my academic interests lie. My paper yesterday was to do with my other interest, which is to do with the history of medicine and early modern hygiene, which I'm very interested in. I had to do an online exhibition for the Shakespeare Birthplace, which involved me going through there, as well as archives in the shape of books and early modern manuscripts. They've also got a large number of artifacts, and they wanted me to go through their collection of chamber pots from the Elizabethan period. And very interestingly, I came across a piss jug, which I didn't know about. And of course, piss was quite valuable. It was used in, obviously Shakespeare's father used it in terms of leather tanning. It was used to make ink. It was used in dye. And I think, because this particular piss jug hailed from Nottingham, which is obviously where my university is, but I was living at the time in Stratford-upon-Avon, so I had quite an intimate relationship with this piss jug. I wasn't allowed to touch it or use it. I was very upset by that. But apparently it was just passed around in the pub, save you getting up and going out. You know, and it's a very clever idea, and I think we should. I campaigned for the return of the piss jug, but without too much levity. I really yesterday my talk was about King Lear. It wasn't really the local geography that we had from the other speakers, or the kind of archival history that they do so much better than I do. It was really just a sort of challenge really to the way in which King Lear has become sort of turned into a transcendental or almost a sacred relic. And I was interested in the way in which the play actually addresses ideas of physical decrepitude and decline. And obviously for an early modern audience, death is much closer to lived experience than it is to real material experience than it is for us very often. And so I was just trying to redress that balance between treating Lear, as I say, as a kind of as a holy cow, and trying to bring back the text's interest in physicality, in mortality, and in death. So very jolly on a Sunday morning.
Thank you,
That's what I do.
Richard.
Surely. Hello, I'm Richard Dutton. I'm more or less retired these days, though I do actually currently have an attachment at Queen's University Belfast. I've done virtually everything to do with Renaissance drama at one time or another in my career. But since in the 1990s I started working on the licensing and censorship of the drama in the period, I've become increasingly engaged with theatre history, and that's probably the main reason that I'm actually involved in this panel now, because what I did yesterday basically was to do a warm-up act for Matthew to try and lay the broad outlines of why the actors travelled in the way that they did in Shakespeare's day, and particularly before the fixed stages in London became, as it were, the great centre of theatrical activity, trying to point out that before that happened, and none of it really happened before 1592, the practice of travelling around the country as members of, in theory, the households of the great aristocrats of the nation, was actually where the cream of theatrical activity took place, with some great performers involved in it, and I particularly focused on the great clown Richard Tarleton, who was attached to the Queen's own players, the Queen's Men. Yeah, more generally, what am I doing at the moment? I'm doing two things. One is that I'm editing an edition of The Malcontent, which is a great play by John Marston, for a complete edition of Marston's works that Oxford University Press are bringing out. And the other thing I'm doing is revising a book I wrote back in 1991 called Mastering the Revels, trying to bring my scholarship up to date, which I think it well deserves by now. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Alison.
Hello, everybody. I'm Alison Finley, Professor of Renaissance Drama at Lancaster University, and my talk yesterday was about boy players in the companies, and using some of Richard's work and theatre historian David Catherman's work, looking at the ways in which boy actors were apprenticed to the masters, the older men in the playing companies, in order to play the women's parts. And I took 3 plays that were attached to the Pembroke's men, who were associated with the 1592 visit to King's Lynn, and considered the ways in which, first of all, how might the woman's part have worked in those texts. So I looked at Henry VI Part 2 and Part 3, and The Taming of the Shrew. The other play that's involved in that group is Titus Andronicus, and I argue that actually all 4 of those plays have very strong women's roles in them. So Shakespeare must have had a confidence in his boy players, as he did indeed right the way through his career, that these young boys could play. And when I say young, actors up to age 21 playing women's parts must have had extreme confidence in those young men to be able to carry off a part like Cleopatra later on in their career, or Rosalind in As You Like It. But looking back to these early plays, there are some very strong women's roles in Queen Margaret in particular, in parts 2 and 3 of Henry VI, and in the role of Caterina and her younger sister Bianca in Taming of the Shrew. And my paper argued that if we think about the actors when they get to the stage of their voices breaking and being no longer able to play the woman's part, what happened at that point? And work that David Cathman and Richard more recently have done on a very important document called The Plot of the 7 Deadly Sins, Part 2, which was a sort of backstage guideline for the actors on stage as to when they were to come on, when they were to go off, who had to be there at a particular point. That gives us the names of many of the members of the company and clues as to the names of the others. And we can work out from that quite a lot of the actors by 1597 had become, some of the boy actors had become adult male actors and were playing men's roles. So that gives us a line through from when they were playing women's roles through to them graduating, if you like, as the end of the apprenticeship and taking on the lead male roles, or the junior male roles. And the last part of my paper took that evidence and then thought, well, okay, who might have played Queen Margaret and Caterina and Tamara in Titus Andronicus, those plays that are associated with 1592, on that original tour. And I suggested that Henry Condell, who's one of the 2 figures very important in Shakespeare's life and the afterlife of his work, who came from Norwich, might have been the player of Queen Margaret and the figure of Caterina in the Shrew. Condell and Hemmings, the 2 actors who brought together Shakespeare's plays in the first folio, the first collection, collected works of Shakespeare, were both given money in Shakespeare's will to buy mourning rings for him. And I think that kind of quite close relationship that Shakespeare had with both of them, business relationship, but probably also a very close personal relationship from working with them through so many years, suggests that Condell might be the man, or the boy in this case.
Thank you, Alex. John.
Hi, my name is John Drakakis, and I'm, unlike everybody else here, fully retired. Which means I can do what the hell I like. Andrew set me a problem. He said, could you come down and do something on Shakespeare and King's Lynn? Well, I'd never been to King's Lynn before, and I didn't know whether Shakespeare had ever been to King's Lynn. And I started with a blank page. And by a kind of serendipity, I arrived at a connection between Shakespeare, Robert Armin, of course, who was a native of King's Lynn, and the Elizabethan theatre and touring. I mean, I'm not a theatre historian in the way that Matthew and Richard are. I'm much more interested in editing and also in the theoretical side of literary discourse. I came up in the 1980s when a group of us that were known as the Young Turks, apparently. I was once introduced as a Young Turk, and I had to remind the chair that with a surname like mine, if he didn't know anything about Greek history, he was in real trouble. But we did a lot to upset the prevailing orthodoxies. I used always to start with a version of Mark Antony's speech from Julius Caesar, except it was, I come to bury Shakespeare, not to praise him. And what we did was to dismantle this kind of canonical image of Shakespeare. He becomes much more interesting when you get rid of all of the excrescences of idolatry and all the rest of it. And I rapidly realized, while I was editing Shakespeare, that much of Shakespeare discussion goes around in circles. Things which are, sort of supposed to be new discoveries turn out to have been around about 200 or even 300 years old, and that you get this kind of circulating. I'm trying to break through that circle, both in terms of editing, where you actually go back and look at texts. I mean, the kind of vocabulary that I use normally, I mean, I don't know how many people here actually know what a quarto is or what a folio is. I mean, it's something that's second nature to me because I've lived with these things for the last 50 odd years. But, I know when I used to teach, students looked at me blank. And so I would have to get out a piece of paper and divide it into 4, and then show them exactly how the thing was printed and what the problems of printing it would be, and how a folio differed, in terms of the practice of printing. And I mean, Pete's talking about urine. One of the things in printing house urine was used for was to clean the type. Instead of what you would use lye now, or, well, you didn't use lye at all, I mean, it's a completely different thing, but this would clean the face of the type before you then redistributed the individual pieces of type. I mean, the smell of a printing house must have been, absolutely appalling. And bear in mind that it was in candlelight. And bear in mind also, of course, that the compositors didn't drink water. They drank small beer. So by the middle of the afternoon, they were completely K-like. In fact, a friend of mine had a theory about, when text kind of, what we should call pies, it kind of disintegrates. The theory of the pissed compositor got to the point where he couldn't tell the difference. So I've been involved in this and in the sort of literary discourse of Shakespeare for a very long time, and my current project, which will probably kill me, I think, is a revision of Geoffrey Bullett's narrative and dramatic sources of Shakespeare, which is taking me in a number of different directions, and surprising directions too, because I have to dismantle a particular discourse and then reformulate it. And I'm also, for my sins, the general editor of the New Critical Idiom, which is a series of books which take particular topics and develop them historically, theoretically, and all the rest of it. So, I'm sort of in the Renaissance in one sense, and I'm out of it in another. Looking at Armine and King's Lynn, there turned out to be a very fortunate connection. One which I think would allow us to speculate reasonably responsibly, in matters of the relationship between Shakespeare, maybe even this building, certainly King's Lynn, and of course a member of his company that had a significant impact on particularly his later work. And this leads us into questions, and they're very large questions, about how Shakespeare wrote. I mean, yesterday I quoted a piece from Much Ado About Nothing, in which the name Will Kemp, who was the clown who preceded Robert Armine, played the part of Dogberry. And of course the basic question to ask there when you are confronted with the quarto version is, who wrote those lines that are ascribed to Will Kemp? Did Shakespeare write them in isolation? Did he write them with Kemp? Did they write them together? Did Kemp ad-lib, and did Shakespeare then write it down? We don't know. And there are lots of questions, it seems to me, that one can ask on the basis of, you know, these kind of almost serendipitous discoveries that you make. I mean, it's great to be able to put these things into a context of the kind that Matthew and Richard provide, you know, that kind of larger historical context. But it still leaves open the question, the very basic question, of how a writer writes, whether a writer is an author or not. That is a very controversial issue. And to what extent members of the company contribute towards the actual script of the text. And so these are things, I mean, these are open-ended issues. And, you know, when you pull the threads, they all unravel in various ways. And I'm interested in that process of unraveling. And although the paper that I read yesterday tried to be specific, it did raise some questions that I know professional Shakespeareans would make their hair stand on end.
Thank you, John.
I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I mean, it's very interesting what you're saying about who writes it. I mean, in my career, I've worked with, I've worked with Alan Ayckbourn. Yeah. And when you get an Ayckbourn script, you don't change a dot, a comma, nothing. It is there. Yeah. I worked with Peter Flannery, who wrote Our Friends in the North. And Peter, we'd rehearse a scene, and Peter would say, "That's not really working, Andrew. I'm going to rewrite that." And he was working kind of off me or off the other actors. And a script which started life that wide ended up like that wide by the first time because Peter was working off us, whereas Alan doesn't work. He just does it on his own. Anyway, sorry, that's by the by. Yeah. Anyway, listen, it's over to you now, chaps. I mean, anything you want to ask, please, about the specifics of what each of these good people did, or anything at all Shakespearean that comes into your head. We can talk about anything at all. We've got the first question.
Who wrote Shakespeare? Thank you. Hello, can you hear me? Yes. I guess we've heard a lot about Shakespeare's humble beginnings and his. We've touched on the gender politics of the Taming of the Shrew and the violence of Titus Andronicus. It's in modern productions, it's still an issue of being able to write a thumping good story without causing moral outrage. So how daring was Shakespeare in his writing?
Would like to take that one?
I'd quite happy to take that.
Thank you, John.
Daring, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the problems that we have is that we rather project our own perceptions of what society is like onto, you know, a society of 450 years ago. And, you know, we say, okay, it's an authoritarian monarchy, parliaments are in their infancy, etc., and that everybody conformed. The history tells us something very different. You know, state fear of large congregations, you know, it's a rural community with all of the problems that exist there, and specific issues come up from time to time. And when you put it into that kind of historical context, then you find that drama and the plays of Shakespeare, but not only Shakespeare, I mean, I think other dramatists too, these are, this is the way, as it were, that society talks to itself. You know, I think our conception of the theatre is a misconception. I mean, going to the modern theatre, I'm sorry to say, is a bit like going to church. You know, we sit in the dark and we behave ourselves. We don't throw things at the actors. We don't get accosted by prostitutes, peanut sellers, or whatever. I think going to a public theatre in the late 16th century might have been quite a dangerous activity, but an exciting one as well. And also, of course, when you think that the theatre building might sometimes be used for other things. I mean, Pete was talking about order and ordure, right? You know, sort of excrement, blood, and goodness knows what, and bear baiting. And in the very same space, you have a theatre that produces plays like those of Shakespeare, Marston, Middleton, etc., which deal with issues of the time, and they're controversial issues. They're dramatic. Now, there are some dramatists, I mean, Ben Jonson's the obvious example, who overstep the mark and they find themselves in trouble. So far as we know, Shakespeare always managed to avoid getting into trouble, but nonetheless, he still raised issues of considerable controversy. You know, I mean, King Lear is a controversial play. King Lear is a play in which the kingdom is divided. This is just after James I has tried to put the kingdom together. And here you have a play that starts with a king dividing the kingdom. Now that would be, I would think, fairly controversial. Richard II, you have a deposition. If you look carefully at the deposition, Richard deposes himself. Marlowe's Edward II, what Marlowe does is a very different proposition. Marlowe's much more iconoclastic. Marlowe understands the operations of power in a much more explicit way. I mean, at one particular point, the imprisoned Edward says, you know, but what are kings when regiment is gone, but perfect shadows in a sunshine day? In other words, all this, you know, sort of propaganda about the king as God's deputy on earth is as nothing if you don't have the force to back it. And what we get here are the beginnings of a kind of Machiavellian politics, which is itself very controversial. So, you know, the idea of Shakespeare, you know, ducking and weaving and conforming, etc., none of the dramatists, I think, that I've read conform in that way. You know, we have a kind of an old-style USSR version of what life in Shakespeare's London was like. Of course, if you go to these countries, I mean, I went to East Germany, I've been to China in the immediate post-Maoist area, I went to Russia just after the, you know, the sort of demise of the USSR. These countries are nothing like the propaganda that we produce, you know. The levels of freedom are very, very different, and the levels of things that you actually talk about are very different. So, you know, I think the thing is we need to reconfigure our notions of what a society of 450 years ago might have been like. And what we need to do is to be very careful that we don't simply project our own understanding of what society should be like. You know, I mean, well, we all subvert, well, some of us anyway, subvert the society in which we live, you know. And we're lucky in the sense that we can, you know, articulate our own, you know, particular likes and dislikes clearly. But there are certain things that you can't do in a modern society, you know. And the kinds of things that we used to laugh at that were happening in the USSR 40 years ago, you now find we live in a surveillance society that's even more draconian. You know, I'm on TV everywhere I go. You know, there's, you know, I'm under surveillance. Now, I don't think that an Elizabethan society was quite like that, even though there was a, you know, a pretty kind of vicious secret service, and you could disappear off the streets, and you could be tortured. You know, that can happen even in Britain. You know, extraordinary rendition is not a figment of anybody's imagination. People do get tortured. You know, and the idea of being radicalized. I remember when Margaret Thatcher first came to power, the odious Margaret Thatcher, that she was a radical. The word radical now means that you are a terrorist. You know, I mean, fortunately, I'm not going to be locked up for talking about Shakespeare, but I could talk about Shakespeare in a way that would very quickly get me locked up.
Can I think another way of thinking about that. What was the word that you used? I'm sorry.
Daring.
Daring. Yes, the daringness is not just to do with the social and cultural context that John's describing, but I always think of Shakespeare's daring as being to do with frustrating, deliberately, I think he does it deliberately, frustrating audience expectation. So we set out with a revenge play like Hamlet, and it takes 4.5 hours, and still nothing's happened. We're still looking at our watch, and all the pubs are shut, and the revenge happens in the last 30 seconds, almost. You wait for a great naval battle in Othello, and somebody comes on, news lads, our wars are done, and the whole thing is, what happened to that? Or the second scene of The Tempest. We start out with that brilliant storm scene, that fantastic coup de théâtre. And then the second scene is Prospero going on and on and on to his daughter, who's so boring that she keeps falling asleep, and he keeps having to prod her. And I think that the daring for me is not just what John's described, which is obviously the stakes are very high there, but in the way I think of Shakespeare's daring is in his constant reinvention and manipulation and tinkering with what his audience wants. His audience want to see blood and guts. They want to see a revenge play. They want to see a big naval scene. At the beginning of Henry V, he says, "I just can't do it. I haven't got the facilities. And I know you've come here to see that, but you just have to pretend." And it's that daring to me within the theatre, within a kind of imaginative daring, which I think makes Shakespeare so extraordinary. Because as Andrew said on the first night, it's to do with the power of the language. Sorry, Richard.
No, I was just going to add to that. I mean, one feature of Shakespeare, which may not be commonly appreciated by people, is he made up very few of his own plots. There are only 2 or 3 plays that we really can't find any source material from. And many of the plays, or at least their subject matter, would have been very familiar to the audience. So it's almost like the old Greek tragedies, where people didn't go along to discover what Oedipus did, because everybody knew what Oedipus did. What they went along for was to see what Sophocles made of Oedipus doing whatever he did. And the same was true with Shakespeare. I mean, King Lear is a great example of it. There is an earlier play of King Lear that the Queen's Men had performed, and Shakespeare follows a good deal of it. He creates entirely his own language, but the basic outline of the plot is fundamentally the one that he inherited from that text, except that there is no equivalent to The Blinding of Gloucester in it. There's nothing as violent as that. There's the scenes on the heath are far more extreme than people would have been used to, and the original play has a happy ending. I don't think King Lear has a happy ending in the versions we know. So in those senses, Shakespeare was incredibly daring, and as Pete was saying, is really putting over on audiences things that they weren't going to expect.
I think he takes risks with characters as well. So in a play like Antony and Cleopatra, for example, the 2 titular characters, Antony in particular, the great hero of Rome, can't even kill himself by the time we get to the suicide scene, and has to get his servant to kill himself, loses credibility altogether. His rival Caesar, a less attractive character but a much more Machiavellian character, is sort of muscling alongside. How is Shakespeare going to redeem Antony's heroism in a way? And he has this extraordinary scene in which Cleopatra's women have to draw the body of the actor up to the monument where Cleopatra has imprisoned herself. What a risk to take with your hero, in a way. So I think that's there. And then that's followed by giving the boy actor who's playing Cleopatra a scene in which she actually beats Caesar in the end. She defeats him even though she's defeated politically. So the kind of power of theatre, I think, and it's worth taking those theatrical risks. And maybe, Richard II, you were talking about the way in which he uncrowns himself. He is powerless in political terms, but he has more theatrical power than anybody on the stage.
But I mean, the thing is, there are two discourses going on here. I mean, there's a sociological discourse, you know, about how the theatre operates in a particular society at a particular time. And then, of course, alongside that is what you might call the history of the drama. And there is a sort of modern parallel here in pop music. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the invention of the teenager and the way in which pop music suddenly burst on the scene. Now you look at the history of pop music and you get exactly this kind of thing, where you know, you will get writers and singers who will deliberately subvert your expectations, and that only arises when you know, there is a history of expectation. You know, and where there is a certain familiarity. I think Richard's absolutely right that many of these stories were familiar to the audiences, not because the audiences were necessarily literate. The vast majority, I think, of Shakespeare's audiences were non-literate. And I would make a distinction here between the non-literate and the illiterate. The illiterate is someone who is at a disadvantage in a literary society. The non-literate is someone who operates very, very differently in relation to language. And I mean, I was mentioning yesterday the gravedigger. The gravedigger is non-literate. Look at the way he can shift meanings. And those meanings exist because they are current in the dialogue. And there's very little work that's been done, I think, about what we would call Shakespeare's commitment to orality. You know, the kind of memory that you need, the kind of cultural memory that you need in an oral society. You know, this ties into what audiences would be familiar with. So that when they came to a play like Hamlet, they would have a number of different versions of that play in their minds, because there were a number of different narratives that were circulating. And although, you know, we think that Hamlet delays, there's a very sophisticated reason, or series of very sophisticated reasons for that delay. Because Hamlet is on the outside at the beginning. You know, I mean, if you think of it in terms of a theatrical thing, Hamlet is outside the court. If he kills Claudius at that particular point, he is guilty of regicide, because the public, that's to say the public of Denmark, don't know that, you know, old Hamlet has been killed. And it's only when Hamlet is at the end of the play, at the center of the play, and Claudius is on the outside, and Claudius, you know, makes this appeal, "Oh, help me, friends, I am but hurt," and he's outside. That's the point where Hamlet can kill him, because he is now publicly guilty. He can't kill him while he's praying, because that might send him to heaven. So basically what you've got there is a debate about the nature of revenge. When is revenge possible? When you should not revenge? You know, when is it a kind of wild justice? And what the political implications of that are. And this is all tied up, you know, in, you know, I suppose you could call the theatrical history of Hamlet. And Lear, it seems to me, is again exactly the same, where you get different versions of the play, which any writer at any one time, or any company, you know, might be able to pick up and, you know, produce a series of riffs on. Basically, you know, there is a certain improvisational element, I think, in the drama of the period, which at one extreme is formal. You know, you're looking at the rules of the drama and the way in which they're subverted, and I agree. I think, you know, there's a lot of, you know, risky stuff there. But then, of course, you've also got the sociological side of it, which is what drives the audience to come and see what's going on the stage. And the reason it's so powerful, of course, is because it keys in to the anxieties, the fears, the current issues that confront that society it wants to know about. We do it with news, you know. I mean, our dramatic medium is the news. And of course we think that basically what's happening is that the newscaster is telling us what's going on. It's a very carefully orchestrated process. And if you talk to people who put the news together, they will deny the ideological investments that they make in news production. And, you know, this is our drama, basically. You know, I mean, our theatres are historical buildings in many respects. But, you know, it's TV news, or, I mean, I'm not up to date with all of this, you know, iPhone nonsense. I mean, I don't understand it at all. And I can't understand what happens when people walk along streets and seem to be talking to themselves. I used to think that was a sign of madness.
But just to pick up on that point about orality as well, and it almost requires us to sort of pass that question a little bit more in terms of thinking about Shakespeare and Shakespeare being daring and what we're meaning by Shakespeare, whether we're encountering it as a read text, whether we're encountering it as an oral text, whether we're encountering it as a monologue, effectively. That's to say, what is Hamlet as a play doing versus Hamlet as a play of as a dialogue, effectively, as a work made of many voices. And I talked in my paper yesterday briefly about how playgoing was described as much in this period as going to hear a play as it was going to see a play. And even just if we were to say, I'm going to go and hear Hamlet, immediately what does that conjure up? What does that mean? How does that make us rethink what the experience of playgoing is? And then think about news as well, and the importance of orality in that culture as well. And there's Shakespeare's noises and the oral landscape of early modern London and early modern England is only really now beginning to be investigated. But the idea of thinking about, I'm going to go and hear a play, just what that would actually sort of make you reconsider.
Theseus says it 3 times, doesn't he, in the dream, and when I was doing the chorus from Henry V the other night, I'd not really taken it in. Gently to hear, kindly to judge our play, gently to hear. Anyway,
and that's the beginning of that program. Open your ears in Henry IV too.
Yes, in Henry IV too. That's right.
So there's obviously a lot of noise going on there. The prologue has to shut people up so that they can hear.
Well, and of course, old Hamlet gets poisoned through the ear. You know, that's the point. I mean, I don't know what kind of poison this is, but it's a symbolic poison. You know, thus is the whole ear of Denmark, and it's a play about language, and it's a play about you know, the sort of negative effects of rhetoric. But
let's have another question.
Sorry.
Yes,
Paul.
I'm interested in particular in the nature of performances in the 1580s and 90s. In 1766, a purpose-built theatre was built in this room, and I have a photograph here of what was left in 1936. It was said to be of Elizabethan type theatre, where you are sitting, the stage went through into the middle of the room with the audience around it. And going back beyond 1766, this was used for many things, as you know, but especially as a courthouse. It was a major courthouse of various uses, various courts. And one of the courts in the 1580s and 1590s was the Admiralty Court, because King's Lynn being a major port, there was shipwrecks, pirates. 16 pirates were condemned in this room in 1587. And so there was lots of things going on. I just wondered what evidence there was. I'm interested, what sort of stage? Was it a stage like you're sitting, or was the stage in the middle of the audience? What was the relationship between the audience and the actors? Were they close up to the actors? What went on? I mean, I think it was rowdy, quite unlike the theatre, say, later on. So I'm just interested in the evidence of what John was saying, what kind of sociological impact the theatre made on people, what kind of theatre, did they pay at the door? So what evidence do we have? Because I do tours of this building on occasions, and when I do town tours, I often bring people in here, and I've got an American party in about 3 weeks, and they'll be interested in Shakespeare, of course, and also rewriting a history of the building I wrote in 1992. So any light you could throw on the nature of performances and how the theatre was set up, I'd be very grateful to learn a bit. Thank you.
Can I start on that? Well, I mean, just, this was obviously a more multi-purpose, as it were, Guildhall than some, and so one has to be a little cautious about saying specifically this was thus. But usually when a performance was put on in the Guildhall, it was put on for the mayor and the special people, should we say, of the town. There were instances in other contexts, I don't think we know here which way it went, when the Guildhall might also be used for public performances at which people came and paid. At the mayor's performance, the mayor gave the company a gratuity, as it were, but the people who turned up didn't actually have to pay. However, in terms of the kind of mayor's play that I'm describing, we do know that the organisation was normally one which reflected the social stratification of, in this case, the town, in exactly the same way as went on at court when the players performed there, or places like Oxbridge colleges or the Inns of Court, where, this I know goes completely against most of our expectations, the mayor and his most esteemed, as it were, guests would sit, as we would think of it, behind the actors. Yeah, they would sit on a kind of bench of honour, and then the actors would perform on a relatively low podium just in front of them, not a thrust stage in the way that you're talking about, which is something that is fundamentally part of our consciousness because of the fixed London stages which use those thrust stages. This was very different. Yeah, so you had the actors acting here, and then the rest of the audience would be rolled out beyond with chairs or benches, as it were, back to the back of the room. And the actors would use, normally in a context like this, canvas booths that they build at the side of the stage, which they could use as entry and exit points and as places where they could change costumes, because obviously a room like this doesn't give you the option of disappearing into the green room or whatever. And so the point of a performance in a place like this is that the majority of the audience would be seeing their betters through the performance. So the performance and the mayor and his party were, as it were, intimately associated with each other in the production. What that meant in terms of how the actors performed, we don't know. Presumably somewhat, literally in the round, they'd have to be trying to satisfy two audiences at once. But we'd have a fair idea of which audience they were, as it were, taking more care of. Now that would be totally different if you went out, once they'd performed here, they would have gone out into one of the public inns and they performed in what was probably a very different context. The stage would be set up differently, and there would obviously be no equivalent to the mayor and his party behind. And they may well have used thrust stages there, but I don't think they would ever have used a thrust stage like that in this building.
I was interested yesterday, Alison mentioned in the Shrew that actually the fact that they would sort of run out of actors, and that the audience watching the Christopher Sly sort of play within the play, that possibly the lords at the back might have been kind of the equivalent of the audience for the play within the play, if you like. Would that have happened, Richard, that they would have used the lords in that sort of...
It's entirely possible, yes. The lords' rooms in the actual public theatres would... Well, they had to use that space behind, because that's where balconies and so on were. That's where Juliet was for Romeo, as well as housing the great people, as it were. And there was obviously some some interconnection between, the great and the good who paid a fortune to go to the theatre, as distinct from the people who paid the penny, and the actors. And, the people with a lot of money paid to be associated with the actors in that way. And so it could very easily be structured in that way. It's always worth remembering, unlike many of his contemporaries, unlike Ben Jonson, for example, who does actually talk about his own plays being put on stage in the context of some of his own plays, Shakespeare never imagines in his theatre, in his plays, the public theatres of London. When he imagines a theatrical performance, it's in a great house. It's at court or in the house of a great lord. And the Guildhall really was that, except that it was a quasi-public great house in that context, and just probably rather bigger than most of the great houses locally would be. And that, for Shakespeare, I think, was always, as it were, the ideal. I was saying yesterday that, I think Shakespeare was always waiting for the moment that they could take over the Blackfriars Theatre, the indoor theatre that his company took over in 1608. That, too, replicated many of the conditions that I've been talking about.
And that's the extraordinary thing, because it's the same actors who are doing this sort of, you said they're moving to inns and they're basically improvising the staging depending on the space that they end up in. And at the other extreme, of course, in the banqueting house, when they're staging elaborately staged and beautifully perspective scenery. We think of Shakespeare's theatre always as being, non-illusionary and so on, but the sorts of things that Richard's written about before to do with the court masque involve the most elaborate sound effects and lighting effects and a real kind of technological wizardry. So you go from one extreme of almost a kind of back of a pageant cart kind of thing in the street or cathedral or something, and then you go to a purpose-built, the banqueting house is the extremely beautiful extreme version of that private theatre space, which is indoor and therefore can provide the most amazing technology. And it's the same actors, going from one extreme to the other. That's what seems to me to illustrate the flexibility and the capacity to improvise and restage something as you move down to the next pub. It's extraordinarily...
Well, I think that's true nowadays, when being on tour.
Right, that's the equivalent,
theatres,
isn't it? Yeah.
And then suddenly we were in Chichester, which is a thrust, and you got the audience on three sides.
Right.
And suddenly you've got to make that, just adapt to that particular condition, or the stage is a lot bigger or smaller. But yes, maybe that had that same sort of sensitivity and ability to do that, Peter.
And Shakespeare is interested in audiences as well. I mean, we can look at quite a few of the plays. I mean, Midsummer Night's Dream is a great example of that, which then sort of takes us back to that moment of how an audience would be watching an audience watching a play. And we see that in other things as well. I mean, if we were to look at a slightly earlier play called The Spanish Tragedy, we see a figure called Revenge watching a revenge tragedy, and obviously Telling of the Shrew is another example of that. But audiences watching audiences seems to be actually a really sort of fertile resource for Shakespeare and his contemporaries as well. And watching auditors as well. Watching, listening, and watching is an incredibly rich thing that Shakespeare keeps going back.
But the other issue, of course, is the issue of perspective. I mean, you were talking, Paul, about the difference between a proscenium arch stage and, let's say a theatre in the round. I mean, we're used to proscenium arch stages and fourth walls and all the rest of it, and the perspective that imposes on the spectator. If you take that away, then it's a very different... And if you have an audience that has a mindset that's very different from that's imposed upon it by perspective, then you have a much greater degree of flexibility. And I wonder, in fact, again, there's very little work that's been done on perspective this particular period, as things change from people looking at pictures and the way in which, vanishing points operate and how this might affect the whole business of the visual aspects of the theatre. Because, I mean, when Shakespeare puts a masque on stage, it's usually incorporated within a theatre. I mean, I'm not sure that I quite buy your argument, Richard, about Shakespeare believing that the ideal performance space is a big house and all the rest of it. In terms of money, that might have been the case. But I mean, you look at the prologue to Henry V, which Henry V might have been the new play in the Globe Theatre. And the prologue addresses the whole business of what you do when you go to hear a play. What you can do on the stage, what you can't do. You can't have a full battle on the stage, so you have to represent a battle in a certain way. And of course, what happens is that the audience has to contribute to this too. The audience is not a passive recipient of the experience, sitting in the dark. The audience contributes to the play. And it seems to me that that's really quite important in terms of establishing a distinction between the sorts of things that we're familiar with. As I say, a proscenium arch we take for granted. And a thrust stage you think of as a kind of innovation. But then you go down to the RSC in Stratford and you look at their mock-ups of Elizabethan theatres, and then you look at the actors. The actors are playing as though these stages are proscenium arch stages. They play to the front of the stage. Yeah. No idea of how you might block diagonally so that everybody gets to see what's going on. I mean, I went down to see a production of Tamburlaine, and I happened to be sitting on the side in the front row there, and Xenocrate was standing right above me. And the thing is, you usually shrink when the actor's going, and she winked at me, and I thought, yeah, that's exactly what... I winked back at her. I thought, I'm pretty safe here. But, the idea of somehow the actress who is... she was very good, but who could step out of that role and sort of, fix on a member of the audience who was kind of sprawling there, But, and I think that level of interaction that, a kind of Shakespearean stage can produce is very, very different. We're expected to sit in the theatre, we applaud when we're told to, we sit still until the interval, you don't rustle sweet papers, things like that. I mean, I remember an occasion when in a production of Troilus and Cressida down at the RSC, they decided that the audience could sit on the upper level behind the stage. And of course, they warned you that you didn't get to see everything. And this was, you were mentioning a story about Maltesers in the theatre. And there was this group of people there, and this woman had a box of Maltesers. And she leaned over. And all the Maltesers went onto the stage. And it was Mike Gwilym who was playing, I think, Hector. And he was trying to enunciate a speech about the value of value. And there he was, sort of tipping between the Maltesers. It was hilariously fun.
Is there another question, please, anywhere where the mic is?
So I've got a confession and a question, and the confession's to John actually. The line you referred to in The Guardian in December, it was supplied by me. That's my confession, and the question is associated with that line. The line stated that this is the only theatre in the world that can claim that Shakespeare performed here, and I'd be interested to know from the panel to what extent that statement is true, and whether there are other theatres that can lay claim to that.
That's a difficult one. I mean, in my paper yesterday, I'd looked at that moment in 1592-3 where we can talk about where we can place. We can make an argument for placing Shakespeare in Pembroke's Men, and then we can actually look at the tour or look at the places where we have records of rewards to Pembroke's Men in that particular same window. And one of the same windows we could find Ipswich being mentioned in 1592, 3 mayoral year. The difference with Ipswich Guildhall is that it isn't there anymore, or that there's a modern Victorian Guildhall on that site. And I suppose we'd then have to kind of look to other points at that, and actually we're thinking about, I suppose we'd be looking in terms of what we mean by tradition, in terms of a kind of continued use of that space on those sites. I suppose if we're looking at some of those other dates in that window as well, we'd be looking at Berkeley Castle. But I suppose the issue that you'd be really trying to push there would be the idea of like I say, a sort of tradition of a particular space being used, and that we could point to as being having Shakespearean echoes or Shakespearean footprints. I think what would make St George's distinct, I don't necessarily dare say unique, is that idea of it being used for theatrical activity. And as I said in my paper yesterday, I'm wary of just calling St George's a theatre, because it, as I said, these places aren't only theatres, and so sort of playing spaces, and there being sort of multi-purpose playing spaces and courtrooms and other activities. So that's really only just to sort of muddy or complicate an answer, rather than to say yes, it is. Yeah, right.
I think I'm right in saying I thought about this carefully for the last book that I read. The only other place we can be categorically certain that Shakespeare performed in that's still there, though it isn't still used as a theatre, is the Great Hall in Hampton Court.
Yes.
That's the only royal performance space that is still as it was in Shakespeare's day. Wherever else you look, we do know that the Lord Chamberlain's men and the King's men occasionally did go on tour, normally because there was plague in London, but where we know the points along the tour, the actual places in which they performed no longer exist. So
what about Leicester, the Guildhall in Leicester? Because the building is still there. I just wondered if there was. Did Leicester get mentioned yesterday in your list of? No, it didn't. It didn't.
No, but I mean, the list yesterday was for the Queen's men.
Oh, right.
Now, I mean, if you want a Guildhall in all its pomp, as the actors used it, Coventry is the one to go to.
Yeah.
Right next to the cathedral, a magnificent Guildhall and still in pristine shape. But not, of course, continuously used as a theatre since then, and there's no evidence that Shakespeare ever actually went to that one. So, as so often with Shakespeare, close, but not exactly the evidence you want.
The vision between sorry, you go.
Sure.
Yes.
Thank you. I'd just be interested to know what occasioned women beginning to play women's roles, how that came about, why it came about.
Okay, well, partly that's again, it's this division of what is theatre. We had Queen Elizabeth performing, or at least taking part in various processions. Her coronation procession involved a procession through London where she kissed a Bible, she appeared and received some, greeted the mayor, etc. So it was a performance culture anyway, in which Elizabeth, as a centre stage person, did take part. If we move beyond Elizabeth into the Jacobean period, when Queen Anna became Queen of Britain as consort to King James, she brought with her a continental tradition of performance in court masques, and the masques that we were referring to earlier on which Shakespeare probably based the Masque in the Tempest, were masques in which women performed. Now, when we say performed, they didn't speak. There were two parts of a masque. There was an anti-masque, which showed disorder and chaos, followed by the main masque, in which the noble characters, i.e. members of the royal family and the nobility, appeared in magnificent and incredibly expensive costumes, and harmony was magically restored after the anti-masque. In Shakespeare's The Tempest, the masque works the other way round. We have the main masque first, with the goddesses Juno, Ceres and Iris presented on stage, and then the rebellion of Caliban, the anti-masque of that play, if you like, comes and destroys the masque. So the idea of harmony is, I mean, that's an example of Shakespearean daring, I suppose. That's a kind of notion of authorial control being disrupted in that play. But that tradition of women performing on the stage is there in the court culture and is also there in the great household culture. So the very first script that we have is a translation of a play by Euripides, Iphigenia at Aulis, which is translated in 1557 by Lady Jane Lumley. Not a gentleman from the grammar schools, but a woman living in a noble house at Nonsuch in south of London. And she did a very free translation, and there was a long critical tradition to say that women's plays couldn't be performed and were unperformable. So the only way to really test that out is to try doing them. So colleagues and I have done a production of Iphigenia, and that was followed by Mary Sidney's translation of a French play by Garnier called The Tragedy of Antony, which is an Antony and Cleopatra story, which, given all the Pembroke's men's connections, Shakespeare probably knew about that translation. So we could say that Shakespeare's drama is part of a wider theatrical world in which women did have at least some place. Though their performances, we don't have many records until the first definite record we've got is 1629, in which we have a script by Lady Rachel Fane, which she wrote for her family, and that one, we know that's got names in it that shows that members of her family, and with male and female, took part. So we know they did, and I think we can extrapolate back from that to imagine that if Lady Mary Lumley's Iphigenia was performed, it would have been performed by her and by members of her household as well. So,
but these would have been private performances. I mean, women displaying themselves on the public stage was a different proposition altogether. And I mean, when in 1656, I think, was the first time that women appeared on the public stage. And of course, many of the women in Restoration drama sort of plied their trade as prostitutes, sometimes even between the acts. Very busy bodies. But the idea, for example, that actors should not be buried in hallowed ground and all the rest of it, stems from the attitude towards acting as a disreputable profession, and particularly in relation to women. Because I suppose there is this rather puritanical notion that women should not display themselves in public. And I mean, all this is tied up. This is partly tied up actually with what Pete was saying yesterday about the materiality of the body. And women are inscribed. I mean, this is one of the real problems with the Elizabethan period. It's very, very difficult to excavate feminist discourses from some of these things, and it's largely because they're so unreconstructed in a kind of patriarchal sense. When I was saying to Andrew and I was talking last night when we got back, one of the best examples of the problems confronting women occurs at the beginning of The Winter's Tale, when Hermione virtually accepts the fact that she is fallen, because woman is, part of fallen nature, post-lapsarian nature. And it's this that triggers Leontes' jealousy. And it happens very, very quickly. But if you look very closely at what she says to Polixenes with Leontes looking on, then you get a sense of, what women had to overcome. And I mean, even though in modern society, that myth is still there. There are certain enduring myths that, even in an enlightened age like ours, still prevail. And then, they come out from time to time. I mean, we're at a particularly volatile moment, at this present time, and many of these issues that were, if you like, maintained in check are now coming out into the open in a rather nasty way.
But I mean, Hermione doesn't. I mean, she knows that she's been constructed in that way. I think. I mean, she turns around and says, "My life stands in the level of your dreams." What are you?
Yeah. But hang on, though. The thing is, before that, we get the boys eternal, where Polixenes says, we didn't know women. We were boys eternal. She says, "That's okay," she says. We take by this that you have fallen since. Well, it's all right if you've fallen with us. In other words, she accepts a certain situation. She's right about the whole fantasy. It is a fantasy. And at the one point, she, in a sense, accepts her characterization as a fallen woman. And there's the evidence of this pregnancy and all the rest of it. And then at another level, she recognizes that jealousy is a masculine fantasy. And this got to carry over from Othello. It's Emilia who gives the game away. Their ills, else let men know, their ills instruct us. So in other words, it's masculinity that constructs this notion of femininity, which is part of that debate, which of course you find in the Elizabethan period. But yeah.
And that idea, go on.
Sorry, no.
That idea of being silent, and if you opened your mouth, that was more dangerous. So, female actors not speaking in the masks. Again, going back to Hermione, when she is put on trial in front of the Oracle, she says, anything that I say is going to be an examination, evidence against me, because I've opened my mouth and spoken.
But if you look at that opening scene as a conspiracy theorist, which I like to do, it seems to me that Polixenes has got to get out of there because he's arrived 9 months previously.
Oh, of course.
That's very clearly. That's very clearly. He's been here 9 months. So if the baby looks like him, he better not be around. I think that's why he's off.
Well,
if I could just take it slightly out of the realm of Winter's Tale, I think all of these issues are correct. What, in a sense, we need to ask is, why was England so out of step with the continent?
Exactly.
In France, in Spain, in Italy, in Shakespeare's day, women did act on the public stages. And on a few occasions, some of them actually came over to England and were given permission to perform on the public stages. It's only within, as it were, mainstream professional English theatre that it's not allowed. And it was nothing to do with the law. Sorry, Shakespeare in Love. It's a great movie, but the Master of the Revels never shut down any theatre because a woman was performing on it. It just wasn't. It wasn't a fact of law, and we don't really know where the convention came from. Yeah, you can say that it's connected with trade skills, traditions, but the actors weren't strictly a guild in that kind of way. It is an interesting and, by this time, unique English phenomenon.
But you don't think this has something to do with the way in which Protestantism in its extreme forms conceived of the human body, and particularly the female body?
It is, but on the other hand, of course, you know, extreme Puritanism says that dressing up as a woman is even worse.
Well, it's all part of that, yeah, exactly, and it's the whole.
And the anti-theatricalists were always aiming at the boy actor because he personified the vice of the institution itself, didn't he? So,
Seal of the land busy.
There you go, exactly.
And that tradition of male actors playing female parts predates the Reformation as well, if we look back to medieval drama and traditions there. So actually sort of having it as a factor of purely kind of Protestant or Puritan ideas doesn't work if we're looking at that kind of continuity and that idea of a tradition. And you mentioned Bjorn's as well.
But in terms of Reed and the wider work of Reed, I mean, there are quite a lot of examples of female performers within the Reed documents.
Within little local activities there were. It's the profession which was, as it were, anti-feminine.
Thank you. Lovely. Thank you. The lady over there who is trying to...
What I'd like to do is just give a view from King's Lynn about Shakespeare being here. So we'd like the panel to imagine a little bit at this point. We do know that Shakespeare's plays were more than likely performed here, possibly in the Trinity Guildhall or here, which must be fairly unique. We've got both buildings still standing. And we'd like you to imagine that with the plague, so we do know that the players came out. We'd like to think that Shakespeare joined them. I'm sure as a playwright he would have been extremely interested to see how his work went down in the provinces and how it was going, because he was just beginning to make a name for himself. He was getting well known. So he would be thinking as a businessman and a playwright being successful. So I'm sure he'd like to see how things panned out, so to speak. The plague, he'd like to get out of London, and so he could easily have been on tour with the players. We then think about his other plays. King's Lynn was a very important town and a port at the time. We traded with the Baltic. You can imagine Shakespeare being in the taverns, talking to captains of ships and learning all about Denmark, the Baltics, even southern ports as well. And as a playwright, you can imagine him keeping things written down, little bits of paper, making notes, so that in future these would all come about. So here in King's Lynn, we think we've got not a bad thought that Shakespeare was here. And if we think about Nottingham has Robin Hood, Tintagel has King Arthur, we think we've probably got a little bit more, I suppose, what's the word? I'm just trying to think, fame, to say that possibly Shakespeare was here. We'd like to claim him as being in King's Lynn.
Don't tell Stratford-upon-Avon.
We won't. Well, of course he was there as well, but just the fact that he performed in this theatre.
I think one thing that comes out of your observation there is interesting, which is to do with the degree to which the sea is all over Shakespeare. Twelfth Night, The Tempest, you know, it's all about the sea, the elements, and particularly the sea, and particularly sailing. And it's a fascinating, because of course Warwickshire is landlocked, and so he must have. So obviously the port of London, or perhaps, you know, you're right, chatting to skippers in the local boozer. Who knows?
And that's an important point about Shakespeare's sources and the. I'm not going to go down the authorship route, but the idea that actually Shakespeare would have learnt by listening and reading and interacting, rather than necessarily having to have done and experienced all of these things himself.
So, the gentleman back there, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Dare I ask two questions? One a quick answer, I hope, and the other one perhaps a little bit more with a bit more detail needed. The first question then is it right? Did boys willingly take on the training as actors as opposed to their trade? And the other question. perhaps with a more complicated answer, was with your knowledge of the plays of Shakespeare and the knowledge you have of the man Shakespeare, would it have been quite possible and feasible for the man Shakespeare that we know to have had the education and learning that are reflected and there is evidence for in the plays?
The second one's easier. Yes. The education he would have got at Edward VI School in Stratford was at least the equivalent of a modern degree. Yeah. So there's no problem with that at all. The first one's more complicated.
But that one does fit in with the notion of rhetoric in the schools and the idea of learning a rhetorical skill, particularly the early plays, highly rhetorical. Shakespeare himself is using those rhetorical skills that he has learned and drawing on a young actor, a young male actor, who may also have had those rhetorical skills, either from listening to other people and memorising bits, but we've got to think of a culture that is much, much better at listening than ours is. In terms of were they willing to play male women's parts, it was a route of apprenticeship in, and when you were bound to a master, if the master was a grocer, then you were learning two jobs. You were learning about the grocer's company, but you were being deployed in the theatre as to pay your board, if you like, because the boy, when bound as an apprentice, went and lived in his master's house. And Scott Macmillan has put forward a very good argument to argue that Burbage's apprentices worked with Burbage and could rehearse scenes with, so Othello working opposite Desdemona, the boy actor playing Desdemona, right the way through. And there are lots of kind of in-jokes in the plays, I think, about that 7 years apprenticeship. So at the end of As You Like It, we start off with Orlando, the Lord, as the prologue, and Rosalind, who appears at the end of the play half as a boy and half as a man, and appeals to the men and the women in the audience as a man and as a woman at the end. So he is a very transvestite character. But before he goes through that process, at the end of the play, Rosalind, the character, has been cross-dressed as Ganymede, again a very well chosen name, as the lover of Zeus, and a kind of erotic relationship between master and boy, I think, is set up there. So I think that is part, and the Antonios that are part of Shakespeare's. Well, it seems to be Shakespeare's name for the melancholy character who has a boy in his charge, and in Twelfth Night at least is going to lose that boy. There's a passionate sense of bonding between master and boy in those plays that links in with the Ganymede role. But going back, sorry, I've digressed a bit there, going back to the notion of the 7 years apprenticeship, at the end of As You Like It, Rosalind, who's been cross-dressed as Ganymede, goes on and has tested out her lover Orlando to find out whether she really wants to marry him, and has been playing the role of a young man all the way through, goes off stage to get transformed back into Rosalind. And we have a long digression by Touchstone, played very, very well as a set piece, where he goes through a long digression onto the 7 degrees of the lie. And that speech has 7 degrees, and it mentions 7 times, and it's full of the number 7. And it's a kind of covering piece for Rosalind to go off and get changed as Rosalind. But it's full of in-jokes about the seven, the idea of seven and being released. And, you know, Rosalind at the end says, you know, it is not unusual to have, it is no more unusual to have the lady the epilogue as the Lord the prologue. And she's almost, he is transitioning into that role of the Lord. She's got her next prologue, or his next prologue, is going to be as Orlando, probably. So that boy actor will come back and play the role of Orlando in the next performance. So I think it is really complex, and I'm sure Shakespeare's aware of it right the way through. And it's not an unloving relationship. So the kind of direct answer to your question, were the boys forced into it? Yes, in a way, but it's a much more fluid kind of relationship than that of being imprisoned, if you like.
Yeah, and forced here, I mean, actually takes us into some tricky area. You've got to be clear there's a distinction between the boys who performed with the adult actors, like Shakespeare's company, and the ones we've been talking about, and the boys who, at least initially, performed with the all-boy companies that were attached to choir schools, because those choir schools had ancient privileges, literally, to snatch up boys at an earlier age, actually, than in the professional theatre, the 14, sometimes as early as 10. And that actually blew up in their faces, actually, in 1602, when they tried to do it. They snatched a gentleman's son, and he went to law, he went to the Star Chamber, and the company that had done that got severely censured. And that tradition then died out, and that's why the boys-only tradition did die out, because they weren't replaced. They didn't volunteer for that. But there's no reason to suppose they wouldn't have volunteered for, or at least their parents volunteer them, for those positions with the professional actors, because one thing that freedom of any company gave you was the right to do business in the City of London. Without being a freeman, you had no right to do business there at all. And that, clearly was worth having, whether or not you carried on with the theatrical profession yourself after your voice broke or after you'd completed your apprenticeship. So I don't think there's any reason to suppose that they were forced into it.
Well, I certainly wasn't forced when I took the part that was mentioned yesterday about Francis through the
yes.
take that on when I was a youngster.
Well, I've recently had the great good fortune to be associated with the company of boy players that runs out of the King Edward VI School. They're known as Edward's Boys. I don't know whether anyone's seen them. They perform to a phenomenally professional standard. They keep running, they go through the school, and they're volunteers to go into it. And one of the things that they completely poo-pooed, this is the boys themselves, not just Perry Mills who runs them. They poo-pooed the issue that dressing up as women was at all problematic. They just did a casting, and if you were a woman, you were a woman, and you just didn't think about it. You put the wig on, and that was fine. They're very unself-conscious about it, and it says something obviously about us that we get very worked up about it. That these Elizabethans, weren't doing those things.
There's a similar thing in America. That they did a production of Epicene with a school in America, and there the boys were so proud of their costumes that they went home on the bus.
Another question.
I'd worry about it.
Hello.
Oh, sorry, we've gone over there.
About what it would be like if a group of players arrived in this building. What did they bring with them? Did they bring the canvas booths that have been mentioned just now? Did they bring elements of platform if a platform of their sort of requirement didn't exist? Or did they only travel with costumes?
Costumes is hugely important. I mean, I would have thought staging, in terms of, I mean, there just wouldn't necessarily have been the space. I mean, Richard has talked a lot about the kind of kit that was travelled about, but costumes in a playbook predominantly.
Musical instruments?
Musical instruments.
We were thinking about travelling by sea, though, weren't we? And, you know, if you could travel by boat, as you obviously could here, then if you were already on tour and there was an easy passage, you know, to Lynn by sea, then that might allow for a more elaborate spectacle in some form, or at least larger number of props. I mean, you need a crown. You need, you know.
Well, in that way, Barry Rutter with Northern Broadsides sort of followed that, didn't he? I mean, they went to non-theatrical spaces and used whatever they found there. I mean, they brought a costume, but you know, there's an old gardening shovel there. Let's use that. Let's pick up stuff. But would that be the sort of thing that they would have? Also, Shakespeare would have done his Rutter being quite close to facts there, do you think? In the way the ladies ask.
Entirely possible. I mean, yet again, this is not one of those things that there's much documentation about. I can't imagine them carrying around the canvas boothing or whatever. Apart from anything else, you've got to imagine they're not coming just to one place, they're coming to several places. But I think places that regularly welcomed actors would have had basic facilities for them, including a platform stage of some description, and probably, all you actually need for the canvas booth is a wooden frame, then just hang a curtain over it or whatever, or a blanket. They'd have to keep it pretty minimal, I think. But certain things are key, and costumes are more key than anything else.
In the Reed project that I'm involved with, there's lots of payments that the civic and town councils themselves are forever sort of moving benches or creating sort of short-term stages, and so in some ways that's part of the kit that was already provided or put together and actually paid for locally rather than things being moved around. You mentioned props, which were on hand. I mentioned yesterday when the Pembrokesmen were in Bath and performed at Bath Guildhall, and the payment, I think they had to pay 2 shillings for a broken bow. And the suggestion is as well, did they either break it in some sort of fit of pique off stage, or was it actually being used in a performance, say, of Titus or third part of Henry VI? And so the idea of actually kind of using local resources. And one thing we know from local guild halls as well is that they were frequently used as armories as well. Frequently lots of local guild halls would have stored things like bows, sort of corselets, gunpowder as well.
But even costumes, you see, we do have it's from Titus when you said that, reminded me, the Peacham drawing is a representation of a staging of a scene from Titus Andronicus, and there are 3 or 4 people on stage, and only 2 of them are in costume. The soldiers at the back are in, Elizabethan day wear, as it were, with Elizabethan weaponry. So it's set in ancient Rome, and 2 of them are dressed up in togas, or is it 2? I'm trying to desperately to remember now. But anyhow, so not everybody on stage is fully costumed in the same way. There's an anachronism in terms of the costuming that's taking place there. Perhaps they didn't have enough sheets to go to the toga party kind of thing. It is all a bit ramshackle. It's extraordinary, really.
That kind of metonymic form of costuming, so that's to say a crown representing a king rather than necessarily kind of full
Let's have another one. Tabba.
Building upon the importance of the cultural context, I was just really interested to know more about, firstly, what Pete mentioned, his research into Shakespeare, under Thatcherism, but also, how this perception has changed, as society has evolved as well.
I think the key person to speak to there is sitting there. I'm particularly interested in the English Shakespeare Company. Both John and Andrew know a good deal more about that than I do, but in terms of a reaction against the Royal Shakespeare Company, with everything that name implies, and its seat in Stratford-upon-Avon, and its canonical importance. And the English Shakespeare Company is a touring, essentially not homeless, but a huge cycle of history plays. I really shouldn't be talking about this with you two sitting on the stage, but as a reaction against the kinds of values espoused by the Royal Shakespeare Company and everything that meant. So we were getting very aggressive historical rereadings of Shakespeare's history plays, which were bringing out what is in the plays, challenges about authority, challenges to authority, sympathies particularly with anti-establishment figures like Richard III, who's sitting there. And that I was simply reading that as a sort of very explicit and deliberately explicit political reaction against the kinds of authoritarian and orthodox models of Shakespeare's reception.
The two Michaels both had experience of the National and the RSC, and kind of, well, actually, when the ESC was formed, they went to see if they could do a two-hander at Hampstead. They went to see the Arts Council, and they said, well, no, they said, no, not really, but if you want to form a large, major classical touring company, we'll give you some money. And it was...
See, I don't know the inside story.
I'm sure it wasn't as simple as that, but the two Michaels were frustrated by what they saw at the RSC and at the National. And it was a reaction against that, but it's quite interesting. I think I'm right in saying I look in vain often for reference to our productions in the introductions to editions of Richard III. It's mentioned sometimes, but you know, I think it's a Penguin where it jumps from David Troughton to Simon Russell Beale, and we're not there. And that's not vanity, I hope. It's something to do with the fact that Michael Bogdanov particularly was challenging the establishment, and therefore he's not been given the credit. He's too frightening. I mean, you're very aware of that, John.
Well, they were deliberately marginalised. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And of course, there was a resistance to the ways in which they were staged. I mean, you know, Henry V, I went to see Henry V in Glasgow, and, you know, the English going off to France were a bunch of soccer hooligans, you know, and there was a big banner across the stage which said, "Fuck the frogs."
I think they are well,
you know,
with the establishment.
The thing is, no,
it went down well in Glasgow.
It went down very well in Glasgow, actually. But the thing is, there's an assumption that somehow Shakespeare is being misappropriated for, you know, these nefarious left-wing political agendas, as though, of course, the plays are not political enough in themselves. And
but that's what Michael was lifting out.
This is what Michael was lifting out, and this is why I think the ESC got the kind of stick that it got from the establishment. And this was why, of course, people in outside London sort of flocked to see them.
Yeah, I mean, the audiences loved it, but it's very...
Well, of course. And I think this was largely because the further away you get from London and the further away you get from Stratford, the more iconoclastic audiences tend to be, and they're much more receptive to different ways of doing these plays, because they see the investments in them. And of course you get to places like Glasgow where you know, there is a kind of political fervour anyway, and you know, people respond to that. And of course when the RSC used to come north to Scotland, you know, they very often treated Scottish audiences as though they were the great unwashed. You know, oh yeah, and I remember seeing a production of Henry V in the Royal in Glasgow, and I was more interested in this little kid sitting in front of me, who every time there was a major speech, he would turn to us and say, "Is this the speech? Is this the speech?" And you know, it was a dull RSC performance, whereas with the ESC, people engaged, and similarly with Northern Broadsides. You know, I saw a Northern Broadsides production of The Tempest in the Citizen.
I remember being in Nottingham and going to the pub. At that point I was playing the Douglas and Henry IV-1, and I was sitting at the bar, and rather than sort of often more middle-class kind of reaction, we did enjoy the show, thank you so much. This bloke came up to me and he went, "So after, you go back to Scotland or what?" Sorry, I didn't know what he was talking about. Talking about the Douglas. And I thought, God, he's talking about the play. So I told him what I thought. And he said, I'm a miner. And we're in a technical college doing 3 days, and they give us these tickets. Yeah, I didn't want to come. Yeah. But she's that fat bloke who were in it tonight. So what, Falstaff? Yeah, he's in here tomorrow. He said, he was fantastic. He said, I would like that. Now, I told Michael Bogdanov that, and it was worth 10 Oliviers for Michael, because that's what you're doing. You're talking to people. There's nothing sacred, sacred about Shakespeare. This is what it is, and it can talk to everybody, and that's what it. That's what it sort of did.
Sorry. Okay, there's a great little bit just after Edward IV died, when, you know, that production had King is dead, King shuffles off mortal coil, and, and the character of the scrivener comes on at that point, and that seemed to be a much more accurate picture of Shakespeare, looking around him, seeing what the world was like. Right. That was the kind of model of authorship that production got across to me, and I think that was so modest in a way to kind of suggest that this is a people's play, and that everybody, once they came into the public theatre, you know, they paid their money and they came in kindly to judge our play. Everybody, you know, it was democratic in that way. Everybody had the right to...
Can I interject? Can I ask, how then do we take that advice, given that you're, I think, all newcomers to King's Lynn, how do we take that advice and get the audience out for Shakespeare and other performances in this theatre in King's Lynn?
I think you do good Shakespeare, like any theatre. Sorry, I'm not on the panel, but I'm going to tell you anyway. If you run a regional theatre, when I was in Rep, which was 10 years, 2 of the directors I worked for said, I could close this theatre in a month if I put on the plays I really wanted. What I have to do is to try to understand the community of which I'm a part, give them to an extent what they want, so I win their trust. I don't alienate them by putting on Pinterest the first show I ever do, whatever. And then he said after 3 or 4 months, then I put in my Pinter. But I win their respect and their willingness to come back again by putting on work that talks to them and is done with quality, if you like. John Neville, when I was growing up, ran the old Nottingham Playhouse. You couldn't get tickets for gold dust. And people would go and watch things that you wouldn't normally have thought they would, but it's because John Neville won their trust. And I think if you put on a play and you get a reaction like this miner I'm talking about in Nottingham, who wants to come back and know what happens in Henry IV too, that's how they come back. That you're not giving them dead, dull, RSC, don't know what you're talking about, love, can't even hear you. Sorry, I'm being rude about the RSC, but that's what it's like at the moment. But if you give them something that connects, they'll come back. That's what theatre is. Get their trust, they'll go with you. Sorry, guys, please.
Well, some of it's to do with accent as well. I mean, there is a way of speaking Shakespeare, you know, this kind of cut glass, RP sort of accent. And then, of course, when you get yokels, they always seem to come from somewhere in the West Country. With a bit of straw out of their mouths. You know the stereotype. And I think that, you know, what Barry Rutter did and what Michael was doing too, they encouraged the actors to speak in accents that were recognised. You know, I mean, I envisage, when I was in school, I played the part of Hotspur in Henry IV, Part 1, and I firmly believe that Hotspur should be speaking in a Geordie accent. You know, I mean, and it would be very, very different if you know, rather than, you know, by heaven, methinks it were an easy leap to pluck bright honour from the pale-faced moon. You know, I mean, do that in a Geordie accent. Andrew, you can do this.
What's the first?
By heaven.
By heaven. By heaven, me think it were an easy leap to pluck bright honour from the pale-faced moon and dive into the bottom of the deep where fathom line could never and pluck up
Drowned on her by the locks.
So you had my redeemer. It's very different. It's very different when you do it like that.
Yeah.
And of course, his death speech would be even more interesting. You know,
Harry,
I better brook the loss of brittle life. I mean, this is someone who hates...
I better brook the loss of brittle life than those proud honours that thou hast won of me.
I mean, it gives it a very different feel. I mean, do you know, what is a King's Lynn accent? I mean... is there one?
You've got one.
Have I got one?
You've got a King's Lynn.
Sorry?
I've got one.
You've got
Have you?
one.
Yeah.
Right.
And they also use in certain areas of Lynn, they use certain forms of words.
Right.
So we often say, Lynn people often say, we don't say we're going now, we say, or we're going, we say we're now going.
Right.
So, and we talk about pack-ups rather often, or areas of Lynn talk about pack-ups, which are packed lunches.
Right.
So they're different, yeah.
Yeah, so each of those idiomatic phrases, you know, okay, they're not there in the original text, but if that kind of intonation is there, and I think I would add to what people have already said, I mean, it would have been better to do this panel really if we'd had a load of texts and you'd all read bits, you know, and you'd all done bits of Shakespeare, because I think there is nothing like actually speaking it yourself to feel how powerful it is and how great it is. And I would suggest that part of reaching out to the community in Lynn would be to offer some workshops to people, as Andrew was doing on Thursday, but actually to be even more proactive in terms of going out to other groups, like adult education groups, into schools, into local interest groups. I bet you any local interest group, there is something you can find in Shakespeare that will connect up to that local interest, whatever it is.
Workplaces as well.
Yeah.
Let's do one more question, then we're going to stop, I think.
Can I ask you a question? And that is because to take you back to 1592, if the Pembroke's men were coming here, paint me a picture of what it was like. If they were coming here to perform in the Guildhall, what would it have been like? Would we have known in advance? Would there be posters up? How would they get here? How would they be? Would they be out round the place? Would they be in here rehearsing? Can you paint me a picture?
It would probably be raining.
Sharp wind blowing.
Well, in terms of sort of advanced press, if you like, I mean, there's very little of that necessarily, not least because of the kind of licensing that was necessary in advance of that. We've got a few references to playbills from Cambridge, which are posted up actually in outside some of the colleges, which again, we always sort of get our best evidence from negative evidence, and some of the town council there, city council there are objecting to those playbills being put up, which are then advertising the plays there. And we can only sort of imagine that possibly the same kind of facility would have been, I mean, it would be something which would have to be sort of brought with the companies. But again, we've only got sort of one small piece of evidence for that.
Do we know what the population of King's Lynn was in?
6,000.
Which is big. Actually, as a city
that would be quite big.
That's a big place.
And a flexible population, presumably, with it being a port town as well.
Yeah. But I mean, by modern standards, it would still be a kind of village community, I would have thought. In this respect. So, and I imagine if anything happened in that community, people would know about it.
It was obviously very densely packed. The river was the lifeblood of Lynn.
Right.
So everyone, that 6,000 people, were all in these streets by the river.
Right. Yeah. Well, that makes it even more intimate, doesn't it? Really.
But it's. I mean, somebody must have known in advance. They would not have turned up, sight unseen. No. They would have, let the corporation, the mayor, know in advance that they were coming seeking that. It's not worth their while to be told that they're not going to be allowed to do it, really. We know it happened on occasion, but I don't think it normally would have. When they got here, they would have been in the livery of their lord and master. So Pembroke's men would have been wearing the livery of the Earl of Pembroke, who was at that time the richest man in the kingdom, and his name and his livery was probably known across the country because he was represented in so many areas. They would have marched through the streets, and they would have used drums and trumpets, which people sometimes complained about. Loud and intrusive, but that was a standard way of announcing the actors are here. They did that in London as well, to whip up trade for an afternoon show, but they would do it here, and they would make their way to the mayor's office to ask for the license, as it were, very respectfully. And he would respect them because they were emissaries of the Earl of Pembroke, and so you didn't willfully offend them, even if you had to draw the line at what you were prepared to allow them to do. I don't know how much more colour one can put on it than that.
Oh, these are kind of like pre-show. Yeah.
Sorry?
Afternoon performances?
That's an interesting question. Usually, I think, where there is evidence, usually, as was the case even in private households, but we also know that there were performances in the evenings in private households, but it would be very expensive to light this place, and difficult if you've got overhead lighting with candles to go throughout an entire show. So it's much easier if you can open up the curtains and perform in the daylight.
We've got a few pieces of evidence which, at that moment of licensing, saying we're going to grant performances to be played, but frequently no later than, say, 9. And so there is a sense of the potential of an evening performance.
But what kind of environment would the actors come into? Dressed in livery and recognisable at the time when there were sumptuary laws, so people didn't dress the way they wanted to. There were certain gradations, and then, of course, to get back to Pete's theme, the ordure around the streets, of which there must have been a lot. So you can just imagine. We tend to think of this as art with a capital A, and that it's kind of sanitized and separated off from ordinary life. But this is right in the middle of ordinary life. So were the actors kind of exotic coming into this, or were they part of the whole process? I don't know. There's no evidence of bear baiting in these guild halls, is there?
I've not seen any evidence of...
No, or even, wrestling?
I've not come across references to wrestling, but...
But, other activities. While we've been talking, I've been thinking of, Raymond Williams's notion of a dramatised society. And, of course, he links it to television. That's how he sort of coined the idea. But, Elizabethan culture was dramatised in a variety of ways. Performance society or whatever. But the idea of everything was potentially dramatic, potentially confrontational, and I would suspect it was a much more volatile society. Could you imagine some of the locals deciding to take on the actors as they walked around the streets?
There's that Norwich moment where that potentially, really does happen.
You see. There are several other affrays recorded.
Sorry, we are going to have to stop. I'm sorry, because we're on a fairly tight schedule. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to Matt, Peter, Richard, Alison, John. We have been privileged to have you with us, and thank you for this extraordinary kind of perspective that you've given throughout our weekend. Indeed, it's been an honour to have you. So if we could just finish by thanking these good people.